Hello everybody, we're doing a demo on DRYPOINT, a non-acid intaglio printmaking technique that is done on a press. You can use a copper plate or a zinc plate. In general, copper is much better than zinc. It holds up a lot better, it lasts longer, it does cost more than zinc, but in my opinion, all of the advantages really make it worth the cost. I've seen people use plexiglass. I've never really done it myself. I suppose because it's cheaper and a little bit easier to scratch into, but I'm sure that there's no way it holds up the way a copper plate does. If you can, definitely go with copper. If you've never done intaglio printmaking before, DRYPOINT's a really good technique to get started with. It's so similar to how drawing works. There's no acid involved. It's really easy to do in a home studio. And you can combine DRYPOINT with pretty much any other intaglio printmaking technique. I really recommend making DRYPOINTs that are small when you're getting started. Even a plate like this, which is 4 inches by 6 inches, can be really time-consuming to make. The plates come as these raw pieces of copper, and you need to bevel the edge of the copper plate, because if you don't, when you pull your print through the press, the edge of the plate can actually cut the paper. You want a nice, smooth bevel that is going to prevent that from happening. To bevel the plate, you have to hold it into place using C-clamps. The thing is though, you don't want to just put the C-clamp right on top of the plate because that's actually going to make a mark into your plate, which is no good. What you can do is just get these little pieces of mat board and I put them on top of the plate so that way my C-clamp doesn't actually make physical contact with the copper plate. The other thing is you don't want to have your copper plate really close to the edge of the table because you won't have space to actually move your file. Maybe bring it out about 1.5 inches. Take the C-clamp, make it real tight. Beveling is serious business. This is like you're going to war. If you're beveling and all of a sudden your plate moves, it stinks. Let me just check with my file to make sure this is far out enough. I have to pull my plate a little further out. I could tell because when I was holding my file at the angle, my file was touching the C-clamp, and you don't want that to happen. That's a lot better because now when I'm holding the file, I'm not actually touching the C-clamp here. What's tricky about beveling the plate, it's really the angle of the file is so hard for people to get. I'm going to make it look really easy. I've beveled millions of plates in my life. Well, maybe not millions, but a lot. Typically what happens, people either put it too perpendicular to the copper plate, in which case you're not really getting the bevel. But if you make it too flat, then the bevel isn't dramatic enough. And so it takes a little while. You have to do it a couple times before you figure out exactly what angle is best. You don't actually want the file, the flat side, to be flat up against the plate. I put the file flat like this. Right now, the back of this file is flat, flush up against the edge of the copper plate. Tip it up like this. It's really just this one edge of the file that you need in the beginning. If this is flat against the side of the copper plate, I just tip it up. And now I have about the angle and the contact point between the file and the copper plate. Start like this. Start up here, and then you slowly go down. Start high, go down. The top of my file, it begins up here, but by the time I've gotten to the end, it's already down here. So it's that type of motion. You have to be aggressive with this, and it's tricky because sometimes your file will go in some places, not in others. And so sometimes you'll see, oh, this didn't take off as much. So I have to be a little more aggressive here. You want to make sure that your file, it goes straight through. You don't want to do this. You don't want to just bevel a piece of it or start in the middle and do the rest because you're trying to get this bevel as even as possible. And you can end up with parts of the bevel, if they're uneven, it can actually catch ink, which is not good. Sometimes I'll have a spot that's a little stubborn. I can see that this corner is not doing so well. And so in that case, because I know that particular corner needs a little TLC, I'm going to give it a little more attention. Should probably have a sturdier table. This table is not good for this. Try to have a table It's not going to wiggle every time you hit the file. You'll see a lot of files have a more coarse side. You want to start with the coarser side, and then you can flip it to the other side once you're almost finished with the beveling. You will see speckles of copper that are coming off the plate. That means you're doing it right. If you don't have that, that means you're not being aggressive enough. You will find there's going to be a lot of hairs down here at the bottom, so you may need to hold your file like this, just so you can get rid of those hairs that are down there at the bottom. You're trying to get the width of the bevel to be exactly the same. I can see that over here on this side, the bevel is not quite as wide as it is down here, so I'm going to shave a little bit here. Pretty smooth. It does have a couple of marks. The way to totally get rid of that is to use this tool called a burnisher, and you just do this. Going back and forth. And you'll see if you feel it after you've used the burnisher, it's so soft. All right, so I'm done with this side. Flip it, and then you start again. Do the same thing on all four sides. Some people like to take the time to actually round the corner. Take your file and just round that edge. I don't usually do this. I guess some people like it. When you're beveling, you might see that there'll be these little bits of copper that get stuck in your file. Take a wire brush and you'll be able to get rid of it. Here's the one thing that makes me a little bit sad about DRYPOINT is that once you finish drawing a plate, every print that you make from that plate degrades a little bit. Usually copper plate, you can get about 20, 25 prints or so, but then after that, you definitely start to see the image starts to break down a little bit. You're not going to be able to get the same rich, luscious blacks. For DRYPOINT, you really can't print gigantic editions. If you really want to make your DRYPOINT last longer, there is a process where you essentially steel face the plate. That's something you'd have to go to a professional print shop to do. It's probably expensive and a pain in the butt. I just like to think about my DRYPOINT as this lovely moment that I have, and it is what it is. The reason why DRYPOINTs degrade is that your etching needle, when you scratch it into the surface of your plate, it creates something called a burr. The burr is like little itty bitty tiny teeth that get created from the force of the etching needle going into the plate. The burr is essentially what catches the ink when you print it on a press. As you print more prints, the burr starts to get run down, the little teeth, they get worn out, and then you end up with prints that don't have the same bite that the first prints have. This is what a raw piece of copper looks like. It hasn't been polished. The plate looks really different after you polish it. In print shops, they use putz pomade. If you can't find that, a lot of hardware stores have metal polish. You want a metal polish that's more pasty and also has a little bit of coarseness to it. Take a cotton rag, rub the metal polish into your plate. It's a little bit liquidy. It will work, but it's not going to be as efficient when polishing the plate. That one works okay, but I can definitely feel that this one is way faster. Rub the putz pomade all over the entire plate. You don't need that much. Now you want to switch to a clean part of the rag. Get rid of that first layer. Now you really want to go for it. You'll notice this is the part that I've buffed a lot. This is the part that still has putz pomade on it. You can see that's a pretty major difference. Put some muscle into this. Ugh, what is this crap? What happens when you don't take good care of your plates? It's just goop. I'm going to scratch it off with my finger. Make sure you're really going over the edge of the plate. That way you polish all the edges and corners. Now that it's polished, I can actually see there's a few scratches in here. It's not a big deal, and I can get rid of them later if I need to. This is the very first intaglio print I ever did. I did it in 1995 when I was a freshman at RISD, and I just fell in love with these luscious, velvety blacks. You can't get the look of these lines with anything else. A pen doesn't even begin to compare. There are lots of different types of etching needles. The one that I prefer is this one that has a cork on it. It's a little bit more comfortable to hold. The problem with DRYPOINT is that it does hurt your hand quite a bit if you do it for a while. Basically, the harder you press with your etching needle, the darker the line is going to be. I always find it really helpful. I cut a piece of fleece, give it a nice little blanket. That's just so much more comfortable to draw with. Another type of etching needle, you can see it has no cork. I would find this impossible to draw with. Some people, maybe it's fine, but I know for me, this would really hurt my hand after a little while. Most people use an etching needle, but honestly, anything you can find that will make some type of mark onto your plate is game. A metal awl. I've seen people use dental tools. You'll see that the copper plates, they're so sensitive. Sometimes I put down a mark and I think, oh, that's no big deal. And then it prints. So that's the thing about DRYPOINT is that everything gets picked up. If you're doing DRYPOINT, you got to break it up into multiple sessions because your hand is going to turn into some shriveled monkey paw. You don't want that to happen. If you make a mistake and you want to get rid of it, you can use a burnisher and a scraper, but advanced planning is really helpful. I always make sure I do thumbnail sketches. It's so helpful to know what the composition is in advance. I went shopping and I got some ginger. I was thinking a lot of these textures and lines, these would fit really well with the DRYPOINT. I draw a literal rectangle, so I'm very conscious of the edges and corners of my composition. I want the ginger to really fill the composition. I'm not going to give it a lot of breathing space. I'll start with the biggest shapes, and then the secondary forms, and then work with the textures and the lines. I'm going to mess with the size of the individual pieces of ginger because it doesn't fit that well into this rectangle. I'm making this part much bigger than it actually is, and that's fine. I don't want to have to deal with these compositional choices when I'm scratching into the copper plate. It's just such a pain to erase big, major areas. I do think with DRYPOINT, it is very helpful to do a value study so that you're very conscious of the lighting situation and have things planned out before you jump in. Trust me, you're going to be thinking about the printing process. This is not something you want to be thinking about when you're inking your plate and working through all of those technical challenges. I think for the background, I'm going to make it black. There's not that much of it, and I feel like that'll give me some contrast. The key thing about printmaking, just don't have any expectations. Whatever you imagine this is going to look like, it's not going to look like that. I think often what frustrates people is when they have the expectation that their artwork has to come out a certain way, and you just can't do that. When you try to imagine, oh, this is what I want it to look like, that's really setting yourself up to be frustrated. I go in with a loose idea of what I'm after, but I really don't hold myself to that. It's just too frustrating with all the technical parts of printmaking. Especially if this is your very first intaglio print, this is not the place to have expectations. You don't have to do a value study for every single thumbnail. I'll do maybe 6 thumbnails, and then I'll pick maybe 1 or 2 that I'm thinking about doing, and that does save a lot of time. That's what I like about the ginger is how bulbous the forms are. Just imagine that they're growing when I look at the forms. You have to keep in mind that you're going to be building this piece with line work. A DRYPOINT line really has this fuzz to it that you're not going to get in a pen drawing. And this time I'm going to try marker. This is a change of pace. Sometimes marker is faster, especially when you're filling in values. For value, I keep it so simple. The white of the page, a medium gray, and a dark. Probably should have gotten black and white markers because this is not going to be a color image, whatever. That's what I had lying around. Half the time, that's what determines my media. Whatever I can get my hands on, whatever's nearby. Yeah, why did I pick this magenta color? I don't like that. This looks crappy. I think I like the pencil ones a lot better. I really like colored pencil for sketching. That's another option. If you use colored pencil with a color, that might actually match whatever color ink you might want to do if you're not doing a black and white image. I'm going to go with this thumbnail. The variation of scale, I think, is a lot better than in the other thumbnails. I like how certain parts of the ginger look like they're coming forward. When you're doing your dry point, at least in the very beginning, make sure you've got your thumbnail right next to you. You can keep referring to it. I'm amazed sometimes people spend all this time on thumbnails and then they don't look at it again. Drawing on the copper plate, it does take some time to get used to because you're always going to be dealing with the reflective surface, and sometimes you can see your line really clearly, other times you can't. My recommendation, if you can, draw in front of a window. So the window's right here and you can draw here. Usually with that big sheet of light in front of you, you're able to see your lines a lot more clearly. If not, play around with different lighting situations. In general, you want a light in front of you as you draw, and that's going to make it more clear. Either way, there's nothing you can do drawing on the copper plate that is ever going to show you what it looks like when it's printed. The way I start a dry point, it's no different than if I were doing this drawing in pen or in pencil. That's all the same, but it takes time to get used to the dry point needle, because the thing about the dry point needle is drawing with it is not very smooth. When you have something like a micron pen, it just glides across the paper. This is not going to be that way. You're going to have some strokes that there's just going to be a lot more resistance. Actually, I'm seeing if I look down like this. I mean, I don't know if this is great for my neck, but I can actually see things a lot better from here on the plate. I try not to do really long strokes because at some point you're just going to meet resistance with the etching needle. So I find shorter strokes tend to work better with dry point. This does take some getting used to. It's going to feel really awkward at first. And normally, if this were, say, a line etching or a woodcut, what I would do is do a proof just to see how the plate is going. But with dry point, you don't want to do that because remember, you're limited to the number of prints that you can make. And so I'm not going to bother doing that. That one print is very precious. You've only got 19 more. I think if I lift the plate like this, you can see better what the line work looks like. You're going to get some resistance, but it does help to really loosen your hand. I know that the tendency when I first started using the etching needle was to just squeeze with this iron grip around my needle. Don't do that. You're going to hurt your hand. It's going to cramp up really quickly. Try to be loose, not just with your hand, but also with your strokes. And you can see with the dry point, it is easier to do short strokes. That's an approach you can take, at least in the beginning, before you get really used to it. You can do the lines however you want. I happen to be a big fan of cross-hatching, and I find with cross-hatching, at least in the beginning, I really try to jump around. I'm drawing little groups of hatching. I think a lot of times when people do cross-hatching, they start in one place and eventually get to the others, and you can see my approach. I'm really doing one group here, another group here. I want all the parts of the plate to really progress at the same rate. Inking is super messy. Make sure that you are wearing gloves. If your hands get really sweaty, put a little baby powder in them. I always have a glass palette. It's so much easier to clean and you can use it long term. I'm using oil-based printmaking ink. I don't have to worry about solvents because you can clean up easily with baby oil. You could use Akua Intaglio Printmaking ink, but I really like the oil-based printmaking ink. It's stiffer, it has more of a presence. It's worth using the oil-based printmaking ink. I'm using etching ink, which is sepia, made by Graphic Chemical. One of the things to know about Intaglio printmaking is that most of the supplies you're going to need, they're not going to be available at your average art store, or they're going to charge you through the roof for a piece of copper. Ordering from places like Graphic Chemical, Renaissance Graphic Arts, they're going to take longer to ship you the stuff, but I really recommend getting your stuff through them and not trying to buy it at one of the big art supplier stores. There is a certain type of maintenance you have to do with your oil-based printmaking ink. When you open the ink can, you'll see there's a sheet of plastic here. I would have a sheet of parchment paper or regular drawing paper. Take a metal scraper. I'm going to go along the sides because you want to peel off this piece of paper that's on the top. And this is going to pull off a big layer of ink with it. That's the way it's supposed to be, but you can avoid pulling off too much ink all at once. The stickler in me knows that there's ink on here and can't stand for it to be wasted. Take that extra ink, put it back into the can. This you can toss because what you're going to do when you're finished inking, you're going to use this lovely thing called anti-skin spray. You're going to put the anti-skin spray over the top of the can, and that way the printmaking ink doesn't develop a skin. Because if it develops a skin, then every time you go back to use it, you're going to have to peel off a layer of ink, which is really wasteful, and it hurts me. For dry point, you need so little ink. I skim the tiniest little bit off the edge. I want to check the consistency of the ink. It's hard to know how thick you want the ink to be if you don't have a lot of experience, but you can modify the ink. I can get this thing called plate oil, and you need so little. I would say 1, maybe 2 drops. You have to have a metal scraper. This is not something you can do with something that's plastic. If you have ink that's too runny, you can use magnesium carbonate, and this is a white powder that you apply to your ink to make it a little bit thicker. The ridiculous thing about magnesium carbonate, though, is that you can only get it in these huge containers. For each bit of ink that I do, I probably use 1/8 of a teaspoon. So this is like 50 lifetimes, probably more, of magnesium carbonate. It's sold like this because typically a print shop will buy a big tub of it, but as an individual, let's say you're going to be all set. Note that when you apply the ink to your copper plate, don't use the metal scraper that you use to mix your ink because this is metal, and if you make a mark somewhere on your copper plate, it's going to show up when you print. Instead, you can use a plastic scraper, or a lot of people just cut these little pieces of scrap mat board, and that will work fine as well. The first pass, you're pressing into the plate, and you really don't need that much. This is so little, and already I feel like I used too much ink. And then I do another pass to squeeze out the extra ink that I don't need. Wiping a plate is so much harder to do than people think it is. This is a brand new tarlatan. Now, a lot of people think, oh, well, if it's for wiping, the cleaner the better, right? That is not true with tarlatan. And actually, it's the brand new tarlatans that are such a pain to wipe with because, number one, they're too stiff. They haven't been broken in, and therefore, they're too harsh on the surface of the plate. You really want a tarlatan that's like this, which is nice and soft, has been bunched up a lot. And even this one is not really as dirty as it should be. In a lot of print shops, you'll see tubs of tarlatan that have been used for people to keep using. It's really not until you have crust on the tarlatan of ink that you should get rid of it. Bunch it up, open it up again, bunch it up. Put on a Benedict Cumberbatch movie and bunch your tarlatans. Gotta find a way to pass the time. You want to bunch up your tarlatan so that it has a nice, smooth surface. You don't want to just randomly have this mess of a tarlatan. This is LIEU'S BFK, and it's a really good one-size-fits-all printmaking paper. You want to soak your paper for a little while. You could do it in advance so you don't have to wait for it. Pull it up by one corner, and you hold it up like this. It's going to start dripping when it goes down to just a couple of drips. A lot of print shops will have blotters, but really you can just use towels. And you want to make sure it's not shiny. If it's shiny, it means that it's still a little bit too wet, in which case you just put it back into the towel. I like to wipe in a circular motion. You can see on this dirtier tarlatan, the ink is much more evenly distributed, and so this is a much better way to wipe, but you're going to get to that point with this tarlatan. You just have to keep doing it. I'll wipe a little section and then I'll undo it like this. I'll try to find a spot of the tarlatan that has not had any ink on it at all. So here's a new spot of the tarlatan that didn't have any ink. I'm going to use that now to do more wiping. You really have to make sure that you wipe the edges and corners. Typically, people just wipe in the middle, and you end up with these edges and corners that are way too dark. When you're wiping, you're going a little bit off the edge of the plate. That's really the only way to keep track of that. What I'm doing is I'm wiping, I'm looking at the plate. I'm trying to see what are the areas that are starting to emerge. Because the trouble with wiping a plate, you either over-wipe it or under-wipe it. You're trying to hit that sweet spot, but that sweet spot is really hard. You're going to have to print so many terrible prints. And even then, you're going to have to still keep printing terrible prints. So it never really goes away. You probably print a few less, but not by much. Or at the very least, you know what you're looking for. Find another clean spot. Always getting this nice clean layer. When you're wiping, you don't want to press too hard, because if you really put a lot of pressure into this, that's going to mean you're going to get very uneven wiping, which is not good. You want it to be as even as possible. Oh yay, my ginger's starting to emerge. This is a patch of shadow where I etched really hard, but I can definitely see it's still not wiped enough, because I can see the little strokes and striations from the tarlatan. That's a sign that it's not ready yet. I'm going to switch to the dirty tarlatan. Oh, that feels so good. I hate breaking in new tarlatans. It's so annoying. While I was drawing this, I changed my mind about the backgrounds. I was going to make the backgrounds pure black, but then I decided, because I was drawing so much of the ginger so dark, that that wasn't a good idea. I left the background blank. There's not that much of it, so I think it's fine. Getting there, I can still see, especially in the corners. Oh wow, this corner is really bad. I'm going to be really gentle. I'm almost going to put no pressure on the tarlatan, because the danger of over wiping is really high. Taking your tarlatan apart, finding a spot that's a little bit cleaner. You don't want to wipe in one spot for a really long time. When you're done wiping, get a cotton rag and gently wipe the bevel nice and clean. Otherwise, your bevel is going to print. If you can get a small printing press like this one, such a game changer if you're going to do any type of intaglio, relief printmaking, monotypes. I worked on professional printmaking presses when I was an art school student. We had gigantic presses. Really, even if you could afford a gigantic press like that for your home studio, I wouldn't recommend it. Those large-scale printmaking presses, they weigh so much that you would have to evaluate whether your home could even accommodate that weight. They take up an absurd amount of space. If you need to work on a gigantic press like that, just join a local print shop. I bought this exact printmaking press. It's a Blick 906 etching press. When I just got into art school in 1998, and I used this press at home for 20 years, until a student bumped the press off the table and it came crashing down. And oh my gosh, I feel like a piece of myself died that day. The lesson I learned from that student breaking my press was you always need to have a silicone mat like this. This holds down the press. If it's on a table like this, it keeps it from moving. This press does have these little holes at the bottom. The most ideal setup for this press is building a really sturdy wooden cart. That way you can screw your press into the cart, and that's the best. This table actually is not good. I don't recommend a flimsy plastic table like this. You really want a table that has serious weight. If you buy this specific press, you'll have the option of buying a press bed that's either steel or phenolic. The press bed that I picked is this phenolic press bed. A steel press bed is overkill. You really don't need something like that. It's so much heavier than the phenolic one as well. To use the press, you're going to need 3 press blankets. Honestly, I can never remember which one is which. I just remember where the thick one and the thin one goes. This top blanket is quite thick and sturdy. The one in the middle is even thicker. The thing to know about this last blanket, which is quite thin, is that it's the only one that makes physical contact with your newsprint and therefore your print. If you print wet, it means that your printmaking paper, it's going to get a little bit damp, and that's going to transfer over to the newsprint, which means that this blanket will get a little bit damp as you're printing. Keep in mind that it's okay if, because it's getting a little damp, that it shrinks a little bit. I had one that shrunk to this funky shape, and I was really worried that I'd destroy it. It's fine. You got to take care of your press blankets. Really try to avoid ink, fingerprints on it. And when you're done printing, never store the press blankets in the press like this. When I'm done printing, I pull this roller up, I take out the press blankets, and I just store them like this. I learned this lesson because one time I didn't take the press bed and blankets out of the press, and I ended up with this big impression of the roller, and that's really bad because if your press blankets are permanently damaged like that, you really have to get new ones. Because if you have a big impression in the middle, that means that when you roll it through the press, it's not going to roll evenly. Before you even put the press bed and the blankets into the press, you really got to make sure that all your blankets are lined up and that it's even on the press bed. If I have my blankets and the corners are not lined up, that's not good because then you're not getting even coverage. If your press blankets aren't centered onto the press bed, that can also be not so great because you want everything as lined up as possible. Inevitably, the press blankets are going to move. The more you print, they will get off center, in which case you have to remove the press bed, recenter the blankets to make sure everything is even. That's not a problem with you. That's just what happens when you print on a printing press that's this small. Bigger printmaking presses, I don't feel like that's as big of an issue. The trickiest part of this home press is you have to set the press pressure. In this case, there are these two spots. So these are the two places where you're going to turn to increase or decrease the pressure. I think it's helpful to always do it together. For example, I wouldn't use this one and just turn it all the way down, but leave this one up. You just want to keep the roller fairly even. I just don't like to mess with that. So usually what I'll do is I'll take the two sides and I'll just put them down together until I start to feel some resistance from the press blanket. Okay, so that's fairly tight. And what I want to do now is I'm going to come down, I'm going to look at the numbers that are on the side of the press. Right now, this side is at number 8. So what I'm going to do is go over to the other side, and I'm going to check to make sure the other side is also at number 8. Looks like this one's not quite high enough, so I'm going to increase the pressure on this side. Every press is different. I know in print shops that I've worked in, sometimes you actually figure out the pressure by looking at the number of threads and you count the number of threads. Now I'm going to test the press pressure with an actual plate. This is sort of handy. You can put your stuff up like this, and then these two sections hold it into place. It's kind of awesome. This is the registration sheet. I'm going to put it underneath the acetate, and I'm going to put just a sample copper plate, stick that on top of the registration sheet. I'm going to put 2 layers of newsprint on top to simulate what that would be like if I actually were printing something. This really is, you just have to do it a million times to figure out. It's how it feels, which I know is the most vague direction I could possibly give you. But basically what you do is you roll the press through and you see what the resistance is. I can already feel that it's not tight enough. Actually, one thing that works really well is if you make it too tight to the point where if you try to roll it through, you can't. That's actually a good gauge of how much is too much. And then you can say, okay, that was too much. I'm going to loosen it a little bit, try it again. Okay, that was still not enough. I'm going to try it again. Because most of the time, I think the issue when people have a home press like this is that they have trouble setting the pressure. And most of the time, it's harder to just increase little bit by bit. It's a lot easier to make the pressure too much, and then you incrementally cut back. Then when the press pressure feels all right to you, you want to make a note of the numbers. So I can say to myself, okay, anytime I want to print a copper plate for Intaglio, that is the setting for the press bed. It would be different if I was doing a wood block. You got to keep an eye on the blankets, because if the blankets start moving and all of a sudden they're not aligned, you're going to want to fix that. So you just loosen the press, take out the press bed, line them up again, put them back. That's pretty easy. You want to keep an eye on the press bed though, because there are these metallic rollers that are on the press, and sometimes with this particular press, I've noticed that the press bed will actually go over these circular metal pieces, and you don't want that. You want the press bed edge right up against this round metallic piece. Don't tell yourself, okay, I've got it all set up, I don't need to touch anything. No, you do. You need to keep an eye on these things. Really, I think that's just a function of this being a small dinky press. I mean, it's relative. I'm sorry, Benedict. I really do like you. You're a very good press. It depends on the press, but you will find sometimes with certain plates, once you feel the plate has gone through the press, it might lurch a little bit. If it does that, don't freak. It's fine. This one's not doing it. I don't know why. It could just be the press, but if you feel that lurch, no problem. You're going to want to use a registration sheet to make sure that your plate and paper are lined up. I always have a sheet of acetate that I tape to the press bed with blue painter's tape. Don't use something like masking tape. That can leave a lot of residue. The blue painter's tape doesn't do that. It's a lot better. Then you take your registration sheet and you slide it underneath the acetate. This works so well because I actually have multiple registration sheets that I'll switch in and out depending on the type of plate that I'm printing. And then the acetate is so great because it protects your registration sheet from getting dirty, and it's also super easy to clean off the printmaking it with a rag off of the acetate. Ready to print? I always feel nervous before I print the first proof. You're going to take your plate and you want to line it up on the registration sheet. I usually put down one edge like this that matches the registration sheet, and I very slowly lower it down. Inevitably though, it doesn't fall right on the registration lines, so I almost always have to go in with a pencil or a pen, and this way you can move your plate without actually putting your fingers on it, because anytime you have your hands on here, there's the risk of a fingerprint. And getting a fingerprint on my print just makes me want to cry. By the way, you should get a printmaking apron. You're going to feel like such a badass. It's like Dr. Strange's cape. Now I'm going to take off my gloves because I'm going to go wash my hands, get my wet paper, blot it with towels. All right, I'm going to put my printmaking paper down. I've got a sheet of newsprint, folded that in half. And you got to be careful here when you put the newsprint over the printmaking paper. Sometimes you're not looking and you'll put this down and actually move the printmaking paper. So what I usually do, just put one hand really gently on the paper. I'll put the printmaking paper on top, put this hand over, and then I'll take my other hand out from the bottom, and then I make sure I don't disturb it. Same thing, if you put down the printmaking blankets and you're not looking, this could easily get moved. So usually with the printmaking blankets, I'll put my hand here to hold the plate and the paper in place. I'll put this on top, stick this hand here, and then pull this one out. It's like a magic trick, except not really. All right. Oh, so excited. Okay, let's see. Actually, I might need to go, yeah, I think I need to go through a little bit more. Okay, let's bring that up. Oh man, I totally overwiped it. Got to clean the press bed before you do another plate. A little bit of baby oil like this. And that gets rid of all the ink. Also, a wipe of denatured alcohol is a good idea just to degrease the surface because the baby oil is oily. After I get my first proof, I really like to sit down and analyze the print to figure out what my next steps are going to be. It's important to understand what's the difference between a proof and a state. This version of my plate, this is called the first state. A proof is an individual print. I could proof the first state of this plate 5 times. If I go in and I make changes to this plate, which I definitely am going to do, That then becomes the second state. So every time you make changes to your plate, that becomes a different state. I don't think I've ever done an intaglio plate where I did not have to do multiple states, various rounds of printing to get the image to where I want it to be. One thing I'm noticing in my proof is that it has nowhere near the amount of contrast or blacks that I want. Apparently I was not pressing down hard enough with the etching needle. I'll also look for areas that maybe I want to make them a little bit lighter. Maybe there's some areas that I want to get rid of. I think probably this line is definitely too pronounced. I'll probably want to scrape this down so it's a little bit lighter. Put in some much more dramatic, like super rich dark strokes in some of these areas. My wiping is a little bit inconsistent when I look at the plate tone of the print. This is called plate tone. Every single intaglio print is going to have plate tone unless you intentionally get rid of it on purpose. Plate tone is really desired in an intaglio print. You can see this is the white of the paper, this is the plate tone. If I look at the plate tone in the lower left-hand corner, I can see that this plate tone down here, it's actually a lot darker than the plate tone up here. And so what that means is that I probably under-wiped this corner. Probably I over-wiped this one a little bit. I'm going to go in and make some changes to the copper plate before I proof it again. But what's tricky is that I really do need to look at this first proof as a guide to how I want to make changes to the copper plate. But here's the thing. The proof that I have is the reverse of the image on the copper plate, as if your life wasn't difficult enough. And so I have to be very conscious of finding the areas that I want to fix and then finding them on the copper plate. It's a little disorienting to look at this proof and try to use it as a guide, but it is really helpful so that way you're not totally going in with your eyes closed. If you want to lighten an area or get rid of it altogether, you have to start with this tool, which is called a scraper. My scraper has a little bandage around it. It's been taped up because most of the time when you're using the scraper, you need to have your finger on top of this spot. If you don't cover it with tape, you're gonna slice open your finger. You can get scrapers in all different sizes. This is my baby scraper, and it's really handy when I want to get into some really small spot on my plate. The important thing about the scraper is you're gonna actually scrape with this part of the scraper. You don't actually want to put the tip straight on the scraper because that's just gonna scratch a mark into the plate. Instead, you're going to hold the scraper more like this, so that way this is the contact point. I know this line is definitely too dark. I'm going to go in. I don't know that I want to get rid of it entirely, but I definitely want to make it less dark. Pretty visible now, you can see the area where I've scraped away. Once you're done with the scraper, you want to follow up with a burnisher. This is my favorite burnisher, and I like it because it has a tip, but it tips upwards. This one's almost the same, but you can see it doesn't curve upwards. And I just find these a little bit harder to use. Take the burnisher, and you want to go over all the sections that you scraped. This doesn't really have to be that refined of a process, so don't sweat it too much. I do think it is helpful to burnish in different directions. The idea is you're just trying to smooth it out so that way there's no visible marks that are left over from the scraper. If I want to absolutely get rid of something altogether, you just have to scrape a lot deeper and then put on more pressure when you're doing the burnisher. Apparently, I was not being aggressive enough to get dark blacks. I'm going to pick a couple spots. I'm just going to really go to town. Usually to get black, not only do you have to press super hard with the etching needle, but you also have to do multiple layers. I'm pressing hard, but I'm also doing 3 or 4 layers of cross-hatching to make sure that really comes out with the value range that I'm looking for. Physically, this is such a different experience than the beginning. Really, what you have to listen for is the sound. The sound completely changes when you decide to make something really dark with the etching needle. Ink up my plate, wipe my plate with a tarlatan, clean the bevel with a cotton rag, putting the plate on my press bed, take off my gloves, wash my hands, get my wet paper, blot it with towels. Time for my nice clean paper. Hand on the printmaking paper, newsprint, press bed blankets on top. Make sure my print has gone all the way through. Not quite. I think it has to go through just a little bit more. See. Oh my God, it's so overwiped. What is my problem? What? Oh my gosh, this should be black. Okay, I suck. Oh my God, what is my problem? I'm gonna blame it on my tarlatan. Oh, I gotta do it again. You can keep using your 2 sheets of newsprint many times. It's really not until you see a major wrinkle in the newsprint that you need to replace it. Clean the press bed, baby oil, denatured alcohol. Oh my gosh, maybe it was the press pressure. Maybe that's why, maybe it wasn't me who overwiped. I give you a little more pressure this time. Maybe that was the problem, I hope it was. There's so many factors in printmaking, it's like you never really know. Ink up my plate. Wipe my plate with a tarlatan, clean the bevel with a cotton rag, put my plate on the registration sheet on the press bed, take off my gloves, wash my hands, get my wet paper, blot it with towels onto the registration sheet, add 2 layers of newsprint, put the press blankets on top. That's, what is wrong with this? It's like all the lines disappeared. Maybe the press pressure really isn't enough. Oh, I'm gonna do it again. Clean the press bed, baby oil, denatured alcohol, ink up my plate, wipe my plate with a tarlatan, clean the bevel with a cotton rag, put my plate on the registration sheet on the press bed, take off my gloves, wash my hands, get my wet paper, blot it with towels onto the registration sheet. By the way, the number of times I've messed up this print, it's common. I don't know a lot of people who will just print it once and be done. There's just so many things you have to troubleshoot to make sure things are happening. I guess what I'm saying is this is normal to have so much trouble. Well, not normal, but don't worry. We all do it. Well, at least I do. This time, I'm gonna majorly set the pressure. It's better. It still doesn't look fantastic. Oh God, no. There's definitely some overwiped places. This sucks. My first proof was the best one. It's not supposed to work this way. They're supposed to get better. They're not supposed to get worse. This one, this one is underwiped. Clean the press bed, baby oil, denatured alcohol. I'm gonna make the press pressure even more. Ink up my plate. Wipe my plate with a tarlatan, clean the bevel with a cotton rag, put my plate on the registration sheet on the press bed, take off my gloves, wash my hands, get my wet paper, blot it with towels. Let's see. Oh my God, it's so much better. Oh, yes. Oh my gosh. Okay, it is definitely the press pressure, okay? Nice to know it's the press's fault and not mine. I mean, it is mine because I'm the one that set the press pressure, but oh my God, it's so good, yay! I feel like I would want to work on it again because there's this little scratch down here. I probably would want to scrape that out. There's still a couple of areas that I think could still use some black, but okay, this is finally not embarrassing. It's finally at a point where I'm not totally embarrassed to put my name on it. To clean your plate, you want to use baby oil. Take a cotton rag. There's no need to clean the plate in between prints. You just keep going until you're done for the day. Then you want to finish it off with denatured alcohol, which degreases the plate. Make sure you have a bunch of windows open. After you finish the print, it is going to be a little bit damp. You want to sandwich it between 2 sheets of newsprint. If you have blotters, those are best, but really you can live without them. You can just use newsprint. You want to put all of that underneath a really big weight. Let it dry overnight, and then they should, in theory, come out nice and flat. Get a stiff drawing eraser that you can use to clean up your prints. You are going to get fingerprints that you can't get rid of with an eraser. In printmaking, the official version of a finished print is an edition. An edition is a group of prints that are printed to be as identical to each other as possible. An edition can be any size. You could have an edition of 5 prints, an edition of 100 prints. Printing an edition is really hard. It's a crazy amount of work. You have to have a lot of technical expertise because the expectation is that all of the prints are identical and they are perfectly clean and neat. You don't have to print an edition. Printing an edition is really only required if you are working with a print dealer and they're selling your work. They want to be able to track the number of prints that are available from you as an artist. Now, when you have a print that's not part of an edition, that is called an artist proof. An artist proof means that there is only one copy of that print. There's actually a very specific way that people expect prints to be signed, so it's important to adhere to this format in terms of how you sign your prints. Always use a pencil when signing your prints. You don't want to use any pens, and I do recommend drawing fairly lightly. Beneath the lower left-hand corner of the print, you're going to sign either AP, which means it's an artist proof, or you're going to number it for an edition. If you have an edition of 10 prints, and this is print number 5, you're going to write 5/10. In the middle, underneath the image, you're going to write the title. Under the lower right-hand corner of the image, you're going to write your signature, and then on the far right, the year you made the print. Let's just do this. I'm lazy to get out of my chair. Oh, there's got to be a better way to do this, but I'm too lazy to get up.